Our next speaker is Bob Jesse, talking on Entheogens, Awakening, and Spiritual Development. And I don't know if you've seen in the program, but the first word of that title, Entheogens, is in parentheses. And so I know he'll explain why. We had a little conversation about that, and I encouraged him to keep those parentheses in there. And so I want to know why, though. Bob is organizer of the Council on Spiritual Practices, CSP.org, which aims to shift modernity's awareness and practices with respect to primary religious experience. CSP also encourages people to imagine and develop social contexts to contain such experiences and help them yield lasting benefits. Through CSP, Bob and his colleagues initiated a study conducted at Johns Hopkins and reported around the world of the psychospiritual effects of psilocybin in healthy volunteers. You can read about that, by the way, at the CSP site, csp.org/psilocybin. This expands the emphasis in hallucinogen research beyond the medical treatment of ill people to include the betterment of well people, contributing to a science of prosocial development. On the home front, Bob is co-convener of a spiritual community formed around ecstatic dance. His formal training is in engineering. I'll turn you over to Bob. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Microphone, hello. Got it now? Good. Good afternoon. Thanks again to Kevin and to Neil, to all the volunteers, and for everybody who's come today, other speakers as well. I continue to think that it's very important for us to be here, to learn from each other, to inspire from each other, to be reinforced in what we know in common, and to be critical, too, of those thoughts, and to refine our thinking. So this talk today is Entheogens, Awakening, and Spiritual Development. Another way to think of it is it's going to be a wide-angle look at the research that's come out of Johns Hopkins in recent years. Well, where's that wide-angle look coming from? A few words about me. I am not a scientist. I'm not a pharmacologist. I'm not a psychopharmacologist, not an anthropologist, not a psychologist, not a therapist. I'm an engineer. And I got drawn into this area through a sequence of events I won't take the time to describe. But it does mean that I don't really have training or credentials in anything I'm going to be talking about. I've learned to rely entirely on a network of experts and elders and friends. Why is it important for you to know that I'm an engineer? Well, scientists and scholars are interested in truth. So at the end of the day, end of the week, end of a life, they go to sleep being satisfied that they've discovered something that they're convinced is true. Engineers, in contrast, like to build things. And at the end of a month, year, lifetime, feel satisfied because something exists in the world that didn't exist before. And there's a complementarity there. Scientists build things to get knowledge, telescopes, particle accelerators, and so on. And engineers use knowledge, like the tensile properties of steel, in order to build a better bridge. So it's a nice complementarity. But at the end of the day, just know that there are people in the room who are more concerned with ultimate truth than I am. So CSP exists as a network of people, most of whom, in fact, are scholars and scientists. And I say network to let you know that it's not a large organization with big offices and a lot of programs and whatnot. It's a group that I convened in about 1993 as I began to wander into this area, recognizing that I didn't really know very much. And in the course of a single lifetime, wasn't going to get to know all of what would be needed in order to have some fun and build some things in this arena. To name a few of the people involved, you may or may not know some of these people. Houston Smith is now an elderly, loved around the world scholar of religion. David Steindl-Rast is a Benedictine monk. Willis Harman, the late Willis Harman, was head for about 2 decades of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. There are some other names you may recognize up there, but I'm going to segue to the last name, Bob Schuster. In the end of 1995, beginning of 1996, I invited a group of these elders, about 15 in total, to spend 3 days at Esalen. The Council on Spiritual Practices had been around for a little while. I left my regularly scheduled life and engineering job, took some time to read, and this group was convened to address the question, what can we do? What's actually practicable in this world? And I'll say more about what came out of that. But Bob Schuster ended up making an introduction sometime later that led to the formation of the Johns Hopkins team, which is headed by Roland Griffiths as our principal investigator. It's probably important also to identify some of the intellectual heritage behind CSP. These are people that I've read and mostly that my elders and mentors have read and draw upon. We have here scholars of religion, people in the psychedelic, hallucinogen, entheogen world, some people involved in what I think has come to be called positive psychology, meaning the study of wellness in contrast to the study of sickness. Well, why did we get this group together? I'm going to answer for the Council on Spiritual Practices and be so bold as to guess that I'm answering for pretty much everyone here. Don't we just really want a happier world? Don't we want to be happier? Don't we want to be able to avoid needless suffering? Any disagreement? Okay. But to start there, what do? Pick up trash in the street, help a friend, yeah, all of those things. But we wanted to look for more that we could do on a larger scale and have impact in a time frame measured in decades or more. Let me go back to the title of the talk and explain terms awakening, spiritual development, and there's one more that I'm going to invite us over time to make peace with. So there's both a warning here and an invitation. That word is religion. Why the red warning? What was your first reaction when you heard the word religion? I'm going to guess that a fair number of people in the world had some tightness in the stomach, and we think of massive oppression and corruption and the propagation of palpably false teachings and power issues and bad stuff. And I want to invite a broader understanding of the word religion. Maybe this is the capital R religion that Andy was talking about, not a religion, but the enterprise or the system of religion. And I'll take this from Walter Houston Clark in 1958, who described religion not as a set of dogmas, not as necessarily a culturally permanently bound function, but as the naturally arising process that happens when somebody has an experience of the beyond. He used the word beyond with a capital B, which I think is nice because most of us don't use it that way. So it sidesteps the issue of grounded being, one God, many God, all of those things. Let's just say, beyond. For people who don't even think there's a beyond, like everything is the natural world, we could also say that religion is the enterprise that results when somebody addresses matters of ultimate concern. So that's the very most spacious definition I can give you of religion, to empty the teacup so we can temporarily set aside all of the bad things that we associate with religion and allow the cup to be filled with something else. What is awakening? Here I'm going to mean it's a first glimpse, a first convincing taste of choose your word. Non-dual consciousness, ultimate reality, mystical experience, Christ consciousness, Buddha consciousness, cosmic consciousness. One term that I like from one school of Buddhism is stream entry, translated as entry into the stream of nobles. And I like it because it identifies that experience as a starting point. It's an entry, it's not a destination. You get a first glimpse, then what? And there's another term that I like for this, primary religious experience. And CSP uses that a lot. You'll find it in some textbooks. I like it because it strikes me as a teaching phrase. If you say this to somebody associated with organized religion, they're bound at some point, as has happened to me, to say, well, what's a primary religious experience? And it will get someone to thinking, wow, is there an experience which is primary to this set of beliefs that I hold, to the institution that I'm part of? And if there is, can I have one? Let's see, mention has been made of William James and 4 characteristics. I think yesterday Bill Richards spoke of Stace's characterization of primary religious experience. You can find that online at csp.org/PRE. Back to terms, spiritual development. As the name implies, it's a process, not a destination. You can view it as tilling the soil to prepare for a primary experience, and you can view it as the long work, a lifetime of work, really, of psychological processing, shifting and identification to remember and stabilize what is learned in a primary experience. By the way, notice in my language so far, I'm trying to avoid having it be too culturally bound, right? So it's whatever you learn, whatever comes up for you and your background in this era, this culture. If there's some new insight, it may take you a while to stabilize it. If there's some good that you perceive in it, it may take you a while, it may take a lifetime in order to make good on that. It's a testable hypothesis that people who have exposure to primary experiences may begin to want to naturally behave in ways that are in accord with that experience. That's what Walter Houston Clark was talking about. Religion is an experience of the beyond, especially as evidenced by an individual's efforts to harmonize his or her life with that beyond. Psychologists have a word for the kinds of things we're going to be talking about, which is prosocial. And the list is pretty obvious. Empathy, generosity, love, cooperation, creativity. I'd also say healing and creativity, somebody who expresses art from an inspired experience or helps bring another person into wholeness through some inspiration like this, could be said to be acting also out of a primary experience. So here I'm drawing the circle around the enterprise of religion big enough to include the healing arts and the expressive arts also. Another angle on all of this comes from a field called behavioral economics, or game theory, and these also are testable hypotheses. A lot of tension in the world comes from the apparent contradiction, the divergence of interests of a person versus a group. Do I have it all to myself, or do I share it? Well, if there is such a thing as unitive consciousness, this mystical realm where everything is one, there is no distinction, we're all the same, we're not only cut from the same cloth, we're not even cut from it, well, that just sidesteps the whole problem. If one is in that consciousness and acting out of it, there's no divergence between individual and group interests. And, again, a testable theory, the more people who operate out of this consciousness, even once in a while, the easier the game gets to play. The greater the gain, and the more that the play seems natural, is just what people do. So back to CSP, one way to talk about the purpose of this work, and again, this is the wide-angle lens through which we're going to take a quick look at the Johns Hopkins research, is to help make direct experience of the sacred. If the word sacred is not meaningful to you, you can say matters of ultimate importance or non-dual consciousness or awakening, to make that kind of experience more available to more people on planet Earth in ways that do good and not harm. Okay? So wouldn't it be a better thing if under propitious circumstances more people had access to this kind of experience? Well, so back to, we have a group of elders here sitting in the Maslow room at Esalen saying, great, how can we possibly bring this about? One answer after a couple days consideration was to catalyze research into primary religious experience. Why research? Well, haven't people known about this for thousands of years? Well, yes, but modernity has a new religion and it's called science. So if we can apply science to this phenomenon, maybe it will gain some attention and a little bit more respect. Another thing that we can do, all of us can do, is help create social understandings that will make it seem a little less weird to even be talking about or seeking such experiences. In a lot of our culture, if you talk about seeking cosmic consciousness or divine consciousness or whatnot, some people will say, why are you wasting your time? What's that all about? And go back to regularly scheduled life. How can we make it seem a little less unusual? And the last thing, again, this is a challenge for all of us, find or create or improve or be reformers within social contexts that provide day in, day out, weekly support for the shared enterprise of living out what a primary experience offers to us. Last thing to note is that CSP doesn't really say anything about how to do that. We don't have assertions about ultimate truth and no particular recommendations about holidays to observe or rituals or whatnot. The world has plenty of that. The challenge is to go find the ones that you like and to make new ones if you want to do that. So the catalyzing of research led to the formation of a team at Johns Hopkins. I had met at an early CSP conference Bill Richards, living in Baltimore. Bob Schuster had introduced Roland Griffiths and me. Roland and I began a dialogue. He is a highly respected, highly productive psychopharmacologist with no prior interest in hallucinogens particularly, but who had undertaken a quite disciplined meditation practice. So he was pretty interested in the dialogue. You know, gee, here's spirituality from one part of my life and my whole research career in psychopharmacology. Maybe there's a place in the middle for them to meet. So Bill and Roland and I began talking some. A team coalesced out of that. We addressed the issues of, would it be possible to get the US government to allow us to give psilocybin to healthy volunteers with no intention, with no pretext, you might say, of treating a psychiatric illness? Can we give this to healthy, normal people and see what happens? Well, the answer turned out to be yes, we can. Do we have the tools scientifically to assess the character and magnitude of the experiences? Well, one answer is we had enough to do a study and we're still working on it. And can we convey this inspiringly? Well, it took the better part of a decade to conceive, team build, fundraise, write protocols, get them approved, recruit volunteers, run the study, analyze the data. And finally, in 2006, we published a study. The study is a report of what happened to 36 healthy volunteers when they were in a room, this particular room at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. There's Bill on the right, Mary Casamano on the left, sitting with them through psilocybin sessions. No surprise to anyone in the room. There were a wide range of acute effects. Some people were on the sofa, listless. Some people would sit up and want to talk. People had full range of human emotions, laughing, crying, nothing visible at all. Some substantial, non-negligible fraction of the people, despite our best efforts to create a safe environment for them, still had very frightening experiences and spent either a small fraction of the day, in some cases a big fraction of the day, in moderate or strong or extreme anxiety, paranoia, negative stuff. So we feel an obligation, the team does, to say at every turn, if this happened outside of a good context, somebody to monitor the person, you could imagine panic-driven behaviors. Again, nothing new to anyone in this room. We just keep saying that. But under appropriate circumstances, the negative reactions, the unpleasant reactions, were all readily managed. And something over half of the people had, according to science's best current criteria for what is and is not a mystical experience, over half of the volunteers had such an experience. Well, might that have been a glimpse of awakening for those people? One of the many, many questionnaires and assessments that we did of people was to ask them to tell us how important they thought their psilocybin experience was. Or in the case of the control drug, this was I'm not describing, by the way, the study in all of its detail, but it was a controlled study. We gave a comparison drug as well. And at intervals after all of the drug sessions, we'd say, how important was that? Was it roughly as important as the most important thing that happens to you in the average day, or in the average week, or in the average month? Or was it one of the most important things that happens in an average year? Was it one of the most important things in your life? And over a year after the session, over half of the volunteers said that it was one of the 5 most personally meaningful events of their entire lives, and about 10% of them the single most important experience of their entire lives. Now, the volunteer population, these are all spiritually inclined people, median age 46 with a wide range, well-educated, not sheltered. So you need to interpret these numbers in light of people who are already seeking some form of spiritual engagement and have lived good and full and rich and interesting lives. About 2/3 of the volunteers said it was among the 5 most spiritually significant events of their lives, and 17% the single most. What we discovered looking at the numbers, by the way, is that having a highly memorable event, for somebody to say that was the most important thing, it hinges more on mystical experience than on intensity. So just because you saw really bright colors, that's not going to be so memorable as if you got a glimpse of what we assume to be this kind of unitive consciousness. Here's the same thing in a little bit more, shown with bar charts. The green bars are what we measured after giving a comparison drug, not an entheogen, medium-high dose of methylphenidate. The yellow bars are psilocybin after 2 months, and the blue bars are psilocybin after a year plus. And what we see is there's a big difference between the comparison drug and the psilocybin. Again, no surprise to anyone in this room. And we also see that having a calendar year go by didn't drop these ratings very much. It didn't fall very much. So a lot of people said it was still spiritually significant. A lot of people still said that they thought that their behavior changed for the better. And a lot of people said that they felt that their personal sense of well-being and life satisfaction was increased. So on one fateful day in 2006, summer of 2006, we released this to the media. This was a fairly carefully orchestrated event. My dining room table for the month prior got turned into sort of a media center, and the Johns Hopkins media relations people, I'm sure, had their own desk active as well. And we asked people who were reporting this to hold off until a particular date. Okay? So I was sitting there at the table at 9 p.m. the night before, which is midnight on this coast, hitting refresh on Google, and literally watching headlines roll in once every few minutes. And this is some of what rolled off the presses. Just take a minute and have a look. Within a few days, Google News reported about 300 news accounts around the world, and pretty much with headlines just like this. We didn't really know how it would be received. Would people be critical of the research? You gave what to who? Or if people would question the validity of the science. In fact, it was all pretty well received. Some of the articles made glancing references to the 60s, to hippies, to folk rock, whatnot, but even that seemed to me to be more playful than critical. We did a follow-up of these individuals, and 2 years later published another paper with a similar careful media rollout, and got another round of media coverage around the world. Now, by the way, what good is this media coverage? Well, one thing is it's out there, you can find it. There are links on CSP's website. Another is anytime you're having a conversation with someone, per Andy's earlier comment, who thinks you're a little weird for taking mushrooms, you can say, oh, have you read the Hopkins study? Here, let me get you a copy. Those are the things that happened within a few days of the release of the papers. There have been radio interviews, mostly with Roland Griffiths, our principal investigator, podcasts, documentary filmmakers are making films, have made them. There's every reason to think that this will become a set of very widely cited scholarly papers. It is showing up in textbooks on religion, psychology of religion, and each of us has an opportunity. We've given you now something to take out into the world. Back to Houston Smith. His textbook, by the way, called The World's Religions, is still the best used textbook, at least in English. It's been translated into many other languages and has been for 40-some years in comparative religion. So almost any class in comparative religion in any college is at least going to mention his book, if not actually sign it as a textbook. The context for this, by the way, is a fundraising letter for CSP, so you can discount it a little bit, knowing its intention, but I don't think Houston was really mincing words, and I think he means all of this when he wrote, "As I have argued at length in my book, Why Religion Matters, religion is humanity's greatest asset after our needs for food and water are met, because it provides us with aspiration, hope, and courage. But our modern world, having succumbed to the delusion that science is the only reliable oracle of truth, is the most secular society history has ever known. Onto this dismal scene, CSP's work at Johns Hopkins shines like a beacon of light and hope. The Johns Hopkins experiment proves that under controlled experimental conditions, psilocybin can occasion genuine mystical experiences." Listen to this. "It uses science, which modernity trusts, to undermine modernity's secularism. In doing so, it offers a hope of nothing less than a resacralization of the natural and social world, a spiritual revival that is our best defense against not only soullessness, but against religious fanaticism. And it does so in the very teeth of the unscientific prejudices built into our current drug laws." And that letter is online also if you want to see it. What about resacralization? Aldous Huxley, of course, was very interested in psychoactive substances and wrote in the course of his career as a novelist 2 books about that. In 1958, he wrote an article called Drugs That Change Men's Minds. And he speculated what will happen as this information circulates. He didn't give a time frame for it, by the way. So even though this is a half a century ago, maybe we're just still watching it unfold. Instead of being rare, pre-mystical and mystical experiences will become common. For the ministers of the world's organized religions, this will make some problems. But in the long run, it's going to deepen the spiritual life of the communities in which they are available. Notice he mentioned communities. Now, here we are for a whole weekend focused on psychedelics, or I often think a more skillful word for the world at large is entheogens, or plant teachers. And we're focused on that. But let's look around and notice that we're not the first people to be having this kind of conversation about how people can become less neurotic and kinder and more concerned about the world at large. There are a lot of ways of tilling the soil and a lot of techniques for catalyzing primary religious experience, and many, many ways of guiding and supporting an individual's spiritual development. I think we would do well to connect with the processes and traditions and people around the world that have those things as a goal. During the panel yesterday, somebody asked about untoward reactions and the danger, for example, of inflation, somebody becoming not quite anchored. And Earth said, well, what you can do is trust and listen to feedback from peers, people around you. Well, that rang a bell for me. That's community. Community is a lot of things, and I wish we could have a whole session on community and community building. But these are some things that, in my mind, are characteristics of healthy, wholesome community. Mentioned a little while ago, a wide variety of practices around the world. No need to tell you this, but they vary hugely. Some of them talk about spiritual development through service, and some focus on the heart, and some focus on stilling the mind. Some focus on cultivating positive values, and some on chipping away at negative parts of our personality. But it raises a big question, with this bewildering array of practices available, what works best? Yeah, I wish I knew. I wish I knew how to invest the time that I want to put into my own growth and development. Well, theory always lags practice, but that's not going to stop us from having a look at Johns Hopkins. We have recently begun another study, again with healthy volunteers, that will look at the combined effects of meditation, other spiritual practices, and psilocybin. It's a big study. It's going to be logistically complicated to run, and I think at the end of the day, it's not going to give very many answers. But it will give some. And our hope is that it will actually help build an experimental science of prosocial development. Why do I say experimental? Experimental means when you can manipulate something and then watch what happens, instead of having to wait for that something to occur naturally. Mystical experience in the world at large, absent potent triggers, doesn't seem to happen all that often. So now in a laboratory, with a pretty good probability, in a single day, we can probably give someone a mystical experience. The recruiting flyer for this study is up at this URL, and you can probably find it by searching for spiritual practice psilocybin Hopkins. Let's go back to the word warned in red, religion. For people who are understandably wary, as I am, of organizations, of hierarchies and whatnot, and kind of tend to want to avoid them. I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Don't get me involved in that stuff. I wonder about the ultimate wisdom of that sentiment, as I have it myself. Brother David has this to say: how do you get from a personal mystical experience to organized religion? Inevitably. Andy mentioned this before. You have an experience. What do human brains do? You start thinking about it. You react for it. You react against it. You want to have it again, or you don't want to have it again. You want to invite your friends to have it, or you want to warn them away from it. Whatever, you start interpreting and interacting with other people around that. And Brother David explains at some length, that's the beginning of religion, the enterprise of religion, not necessarily a particular one, the system of religion. So let's learn to make peace with it. It's out there. Not only is it out there, but the world's finest land and architecture and music and so on have all been devoted to this enterprise. Wouldn't it be interesting if it became more potent at delivering on its own promise of helping people be kinder to each other? There are the problems that we all know about. Just to acknowledge them quickly with a slide, I won't go into them, but forewarned is forearmed. They're not insurmountable. Walter Houston Clark, psychologist of religion at Andover Newton, in a really wonderful and underappreciated book called The Psychology of Religion, one of several books to carry that title, in addition to offering this spacious interpretation of the word religion, also said we can actually evaluate, we can appraise religion on how effective it is. And he offered 10 questions that any group that calls itself religion, any enterprise that calls itself religion, might want to ask. I won't take the time to read them now or to expand on the ones that are non-obvious, but they are available for you at this URL, including his full description of each of those 10 questions. I get reminded every so often that it's one thing to talk and another thing to walk. And every so often in life, something comes to me that reminds me that maybe I better spend a little more time in my own personal practice and a little less time talking. What can we all do as individuals? What can I do? Practice, find people that will teach me something or guide me or hold space for me, surround myself with community, longitudinally stable, I hope multi-generational community from which I can receive wisdom and containment and challenge and support. As groups, we have more skillful means available to us. It's very, very hard to go this path alone. There's been mention made several times in the course of the conference, well, so we think that we're onto something here. Entheogens, primary experience and whatnot. We want to be agents of change in the world. We want to address inappropriate resistance. Well, there are better and worse ways of doing that. And what Brother David has to say simply is that our own authenticity as mystics, as people who have had at least a glimpse of awakening, will be visible in part by how skillfully we do that, by how skillfully we talk with or approach or oppose the people that we feel we must. Because, and this is the key line, mystics come from a realm where we and they are one. I think we're probably close to the end of the time, so I will stop there. Boy, let me just go down these really quickly. Random stuff that there wasn't space to put in the talk. If you don't know about spiral dynamics, I highly recommend that you find it on the web and read about it. If it's hard to understand how religion could mean something as archaic as human sacrifice, and religion could also mean something as worshiping multiple gods, and religion could mean worshiping a bearded white guy, and religion could mean this just contact with the beyond and behaving in accord. How can it mean all those things? Spiral dynamics will bring that into focus for you. Ken Wilber, just let me acknowledge him as a source for some of this thinking. Charles Chard as well. And here are some URLs you might want to write down. There's actually a page on nomenclature, which will describe, actually with words none of which I wrote, all by quoting other things, some of the burden that I think that we carry when we use the word psychedelic outside of our own insider circles. And there's a document up here, CSP Quotes 2, which is just a collection of interesting tidbits from interesting writers from the people whose names you saw at the beginning of this talk. Thanks very much. Bill and Mary Passamano.
Thank you very much. Okay, who wants to participate? Andy, hold on.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I'm left with a concern, however, that your results may be self-fulfilling. Presumably your volunteers were psychedelic naive, but anyone who's lived in Western culture in the last 50 years can't be naive that psychedelics are what hippies take to have spiritual experiences. And then they walk into a room with a Buddha and a rose, which are very powerful signifiers of spirituality. To what extent did you try and factor out people's expectations? And did they come in expecting to have a spiritual experience?
Excellent questions. I have no doubt that the people that we specifically recruited and screened for and were prepared in the way that they were prepared, were on the life paths that they were on, came in at least expecting and probably hoping for a, quote, spiritual, whatever that means to them, experience. So there is a degree to which this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it would be interesting to run a similar experiment with a different volunteer pool. On the other hand, this was a controlled experiment. I did not intend for this talk to be a full explanation just about that one study. But as I hinted, we had a control substance, a non-entheogenic psychoactive, in particular methylphenidate, trade name Ritalin. And people didn't know what they were getting. The guides didn't know what they were getting. The principal investigator didn't. So I think of the study as being not double-blind, but triple-blind. 3 separate parties were kept unaware. And we did everything that we could to not bias people to have particular expectations. We encouraged them to not think at the beginning of the session, ooh, which of 11 different substances did I receive? And what the controlled science says is that there were very large, very statistically significant differences between psilocybin and the controlled substance. And some people did have spiritual experiences, important, meaningful experiences, in the company of Bill and Mary and beautiful music and a whole day given to introspection.
I suppose that actually it's kind of along the same lines. I'm just interested to know if the people in the experiment had previous experiences with drugs of any sort, marijuana or mushrooms, LSD, or if you were looking for people who didn't have previous experience that would have influenced their initial reaction to a new experience.
The latter. We wanted to be able to show, if it would be the case, if it were the case, to have room to show a significant difference in lifetime mystical experience between intake and completion of the study.
Hi, I just have a quick question about the measurement of mysticism. Like when you say that 58% said they achieved complete mystical experience, can you just go into more the definition of that and the exact battery or measurement that you used?
I can try. Several measures were used. The one that's most widely used in the psychology of religion is a scale developed by a psychologist named Ralph Hood. It's called the mysticism scale or the Hood mysticism scale. What he did, I'm guessing 20 years ago now, was look at the characteristics from James and Stace, which they derived by looking at the world's mystical literature. And he did what psychologists call factor analysis to try to see if he could discern what are questions and categories taken as a whole that would explain mystical experience. So we use that scale. And the definition of complete or not is somewhat arbitrary.
Another comment over here.
I'm curious about what your thoughts are on comparing these laboratory experiments with double-blind, placebo-controlled studies.
Sorry, I missed a few words.
I've said I'm curious how you would compare the work that's being done at Hopkins and other universities with placebo double-blind laboratory studies with studies of groups in either the shamanic or neo-shamanic traditions, for example, studies on people using ayahuasca in South America as part of their religious communities. How would you, why did CSP decide to really focus on this sort of work as opposed to more community-based, anthropologically based in situ studies of existing spiritual practices with plant teachers?
Thank you. I think I got most of your question, and please come back at me if I didn't. Okay, here goes. You can go into a foreign land and be part of a community and apply the tools of an anthropologist or a sociologist to study interesting phenomena. And we learn a lot from that. I learn a lot from that. But there's a certain kind of currency in the popular culture that kind of science might lack. On the other hand, a controlled scientific study with very specific outcome measures coming from a top-notch research university lands differently. I'm going to speculate, we don't know of course, that a similar study of an ayahuasca-using group or a mushroom-using group would not have received the press, wouldn't have penetrated into the culture as much.
Also, first of all, it's a very interesting study, and as you know, I really liked that. I know Roland quite well, and we helped him also to design that study. But Andy made a very important argument. The study, in fact, is biased because most of the subject had expectations and a certain worldview and religious background. So, but it doesn't matter for me. I think the most important is that you can show that this experience has an impact, because we have all known that there is that experience. And if you look at data from Leuner from 1971, where he had a group with 130 subjects doing exactly the same, there were only 13% after 5 years that had a personality change. That means it had an impact. So I think the most important or a nice study would be to use people that are atheists or agnostics or whatsoever, and follow them up for 5 years at least to show what's the impact of such an experience. Just to have the experience is not the goal. And when you say we take science to undermine science, or what you had a statement like that, then it's important that you sort out this in your talk, this kind of saying 60% go up and have that experience, because it's really, I think, wishful thinking, or how you say that?
Self-fulfilling. Say it again. Self-fulfilling?
Okay, it's that term. I think it's very important.
I think I understand the point. It would be fascinating to run an experiment like this again with people who identify as agnostic or atheistic. There is in the literature, Houston Smith published a book, we helped him publish a book some years ago, of his collected writings over 40 years about the entheogens. And he received a lot of correspondence as a result of it, including, as I imagine we have all heard, each different ones, people saying, wow, I had no concept of the divine, rejected it and whatnot, had a powerful experience and became convinced, which is one reason why I've offered as a definition of an awakening, a first convincing taste. But I do acknowledge the point. And I acknowledge the point that a 1 year, 14-month, whatever follow-up is not a very long period of time. Rick Doblin did a 25-year follow-up of most of the volunteers in the Good Friday experiment in 1962. And those people do still refer back to the experience and would assert that their lives were changed by it. As for the self-fulfilling prophecy, here is a very unscientific comment. I welcome being part of a community that will wish me and us into a happier life.